In the year 1832, in a remote and unremarkable stretch of rural Georgia, whispers began to thicken like fog. The people of the settlement were already pressed by the weight of failing harvests, fevers that moved from cabin to cabin, and the constant fear of losing children to disease before they could walk. Life in such a place was hard enough, yet something else had begun to stir. Something not of hunger or weather, but of unease. It began with murmurs in the church pews, spread across hushed voices at the gristmill, and crept into conversations by the lamplight of porches at dusk. All threads of gossip wound themselves toward one family, a household that sat at the farthest edge of town. Inside that house lived two children, twins, who had become the center of an unspeakable mystery. They were born in the winter, two small bodies wailing in the night air, as normal as any newborns. Yet as years passed, townsfolk realized that the twins had slipped away from the natural course of life. The other children grew, sprouting into adolescence, their voices breaking, their limbs lengthening, their hands taking on the calluses of farm work. But the twins remained exactly as they were, locked in the bodies of 5-year-olds even as nearly a decade rolled by. At first, neighbors told themselves it was an illusion. Perhaps they were smaller than average, perhaps weak from illness. But time made denial impossible. No new height, no deepening of the voice, no change in the softness of their features. Their faces stayed round, their bodies delicate, like figures preserved in wax. It was as if time itself had overlooked them, moving forward for all others but leaving them behind in a perpetual childhood. Such things could not be accepted quietly in a God-fearing town. This was the South in the 1830s, where the Bible explained the world more firmly than science ever could. Some muttered that the family had sinned gravely and their children were a punishment sent down by God. Others whispered that something unholy had entered the bloodline, that demons had disguised themselves in the form of children. And still others spoke of older tales, folk memories passed down by settlers who feared the curses of the land's previous inhabitants. Mothers tugged their own children away when the twins appeared in public. Even the boldest of boys, who would wrestle snakes and climb unstable barns, kept their distance. They had given the pair a name among themselves, the ones who never grew, and though said in childish tones, the words carried the sting of a curse. Those who saw the twins often came away unsettled. It was not only their size or their stillness, it was their eyes. Witnesses recalled gazes that lingered too long, eyes too knowing for children, watching with a silence that pressed uneasily on the chest. They did not fidget, did not laugh like others their age. They often stood unmoving, side by side, their small hands clasped or hanging limply, as if their bodies were shells that belonged to something older. One farmer swore he saw them at the edge of the pine forest one evening, standing like statues, their pale faces fixed toward the sinking sun. They did not speak, did not blink, and though he called to them, they made no reply. When he returned the next day, he swore the grass around where they had stood had yellowed, as if the ground itself had recoiled. His account was mocked by some, but it was not forgotten. Their parents, once well regarded, bore the burden of shame. The father, a man of once broad shoulders, grew stooped and thin. When forced to pass through town, he kept his head low, as though bracing against invisible judgment. The mother aged before her time. Her once bright hair dulled into gray, her face marked with sleepless hollows beneath her eyes. They attended church less and less, until finally not at all. Their wooden house, isolated at the edge of the fields, grew darker. Its shutters closed against both sun and the gaze of neighbors. People began to wonder if even the parents feared their own children. In the oppressive heat of summer, speculation clung to every gathering. On porches and in taverns, men and women lowered their voices, their words heavy with fear. Are they truly human? Perhaps they're a sign, a test of our faith. Or maybe this is the land's revenge, the curse of those driven from it, accounts multiplied, strange claims that made the hair rise on the back of the neck. A farmer testified he had seen the twins by the riverbank at dawn, their small hands gathering berries. But hours later, when he entered the square, there they were again, sitting side by side at their own window, staring out into the daylight with empty expressions. The distance was impossible to cross in so short a time, and yet he insisted it was so. His words, scrawled later in a faded journal, read, I swear before God's own eyes. I met them twice that day, once by the river and again in their home. No living thing can be in two places so quickly. And so the twins became more than children. They became a shadow pressing down on the town. A silent wound the community could not heal. People did not speak openly, but all carried the same fear. The children were there, yet not truly there. Alive, but untouched by the rhythm of life. A reminder that the world might hold mysteries too dark for men to confront. Years later, fragments of old diaries and family records would still speak of them, scribbled in fading ink. Many began with the same haunting sentence in that year in Georgia. There were two children who never grew. If you are drawn to the darker corners of forgotten history, the kind that sends a chill through your bones and lingers long after the telling, consider subscribing to this channel. History hides more secrets than most realize. Secrets like this one that refuse to rest. And I want to know, where are you watching from? And at what hour? Share it in the comments, so we may all see how far this story travels. For now, let us step back into that haunted year of 1832, into the humid fields of Georgia, where a strange and dreadful mystery had only just begun to take root. The burden of the twins' condition did not weigh solely upon the children themselves. It pressed down even heavier upon their parents, who had once been pillars of the small Georgia town. Before the birth, the family had enjoyed a modest but respectable standing. The father, Elias, was known for his strong back and steady work in the fields. The mother, Margaret, came from a line of women praised for their piety and skill in keeping a household. In the eyes of neighbors, they were the sort of couple others could trust, decent, diligent, touched with the quiet dignity of those who built communities out of wilderness. But after the twins came, and especially after the years passed without change in their bodies, that reputation began to decay. It was not sudden, but like rot that creeps up the beam of a house. Slowly, invisibly at first, until the whole structure groans beneath it. At church, people began to shift in the pews when the family entered. Children were hushed, as though their laughter might offend. Women looked away from Margaret, who once had been greeted with warm smiles. The pastor spoke of sin in vague terms during his sermons, his eyes drifting all too often toward the pew where the family sat. Whispers thickened after each service. God is punishing them, some said. Others claimed Elias had made a bargain with something unholy, a pact hidden from all but exposed in the frozen bodies of his children. The shame weighed visibly upon Elias. Once upright, his shoulders now curved forward as if under an invisible yoke. When he passed through the town square, he no longer stopped to greet acquaintances or linger in conversation. He walked quickly, head down, his hat brim shading his face. Some remarked that his hands trembled when he paid for supplies, and that he seemed eager to leave, as though fearing eyes upon his back. Margaret bore her own suffering in silence. Once lively, she now kept her gaze lowered, her voice soft, her presence withdrawn. Her hair, once the color of wheat in the sun, grayed before its time. Neighbors whispered that she rarely slept, for lamps were seen burning in their house long past midnight. Some said they could hear her pacing, as though she wandered endlessly from room to room, unable to rest. What broke her spirit most, perhaps, was the way others looked at her children. Where once townsfolk had cooed over their youth, now they avoided their eyes. Even in their smallness, the twins seemed to carry the weight of an accusation. People spoke of Margaret with pity, but behind it was blame, as though something in her womb had been tainted, as though she had borne not blessings, but reminders of judgment. The family withdrew. The shutters of their house stayed closed, the sound of life within muted. Elias sold less of his crops at market, and the children were rarely seen beyond the edges of their property. When they did appear, they clung to one another's hands, their faces pale, their expressions still. Margaret kept them close, watching warily, as though even a glance from a neighbor might wound them. But withdrawal did not erase suspicion. It only deepened it. When storms struck the town, some whispered that the twins had called them forth. When a fire consumed a barn on the outskirts, tongues wagged that it was the curse of Elias's family. A fever carried off 3 children in one season, and some mothers openly said they would not allow their little ones near the twins again. The line between coincidence and superstition blurred, until the family seemed to carry the weight of every misfortune. Elias fought back in small ways. He confronted one man in the tavern who had mocked his children aloud, striking him across the jaw with such fury that blood stained the floorboards. But even this act of defense twisted against him. It was said Elias's anger was not righteous but unnatural, a violence born of dark desperation. Each attempt to resist only seemed to tighten the noose of suspicion around his household. Margaret's grief turned inward. Diaries later discovered, written in her careful hand, revealed fragments of her torment, one page smudged with ink and tears. Read, "They look upon me as if I carry poison in my very blood. What mother could bear such stares? If only they knew my children are gentle. They harm no one. Yet they will not grow. They will not change. And I am left to wonder if God himself has abandoned me." The children themselves seemed aware of their parents' suffering, though they rarely spoke. When neighbors did see them, it was often from a distance, watching silently from a window or standing side by side in the yard. They rarely smiled, rarely played. Some swore they never heard the children's voices at all, though others claimed that, on certain nights, soft murmurs drifted from their home words in tones too low and steady for children of their supposed age. By the late 1830s, the family had become nearly invisible, their presence an unspoken scar upon the community. Yet, for all the isolation, no one could forget them. For every misfortune, their names returned, whispered as both explanation and warning. A family that had once been embraced was now burdened with shame so deep it reached beyond reputation, it became legend. In that Georgia town, people began to say the twins do not grow, and their parents do not live. It was a cruel refrain, but it carried the truth of how the family had been buried alive beneath suspicion, condemned not by proof but by fear. And yet, the story was far from over. For what weighed upon their parents was only the beginning of a deeper descent, where shame would turn into desperation, and whispers into something darker. By the time the twins should have been on the verge of adolescence, their condition could no longer be dismissed as superstition or rumor. The community had watched too many years pass, too many seasons of planting and harvest, and yet the children remained unchanged. They were still small, still delicate, still frozen in bodies that seemed locked in time. It was then that outsiders, men of science, or what passed for science in those years, began to take notice. Traveling physicians and curious doctors occasionally passed through rural Georgia. Most were men chasing cases to bolster their reputations or to publish in journals back east. When whispers of the twins spread beyond the town, a few of these physicians demanded to see them, urging Elias and Margaret to permit examinations. At first, the parents resisted. They feared mockery, feared exploitation. But with each visit came the same promises that perhaps medicine could explain what faith and rumor could not. Elias relented, perhaps clinging to hope that any explanation would free his family from the prison of suspicion. The examinations were crude by modern standards. Physicians carried leather satchels filled with instruments more symbolic than effective calipers. Magnifying glasses, even simple scales. The twins were measured and weighed, their limbs inspected, their teeth counted. Each time, the findings were the same. Their bodies were healthy, their hearts steady, their lungs clear. Yet in age they were nearly 12, and in form they were no more than 5. One doctor wrote in his notes, later discovered in the archives of a medical college, the children are vigorous in constitution, yet arrested in development. Their limbs are proportionate, though without signs of maturity. Their faces retain infantile character, the jaw small, the eyes disproportionately large. Curiously, their demeanor is not as of children, but rather as of adults inhabiting juvenile frames. That last line, particularly, sent chills through later readers, for it hinted at what townsfolk had long whispered, that the twins carried within them a presence beyond their years. Other physicians attempted to explain the phenomenon with terms of the era retardation of growth, arrested development, infantile permanence, but none could offer a cause. Nutrition was not to blame, for the family fed them adequately. Disease left no mark, for their bodies showed none of the ravages that illness typically inflicted. One even suggested that their condition might be a unique example of Providence's mystery, carefully choosing words that straddled science and theology. The visits themselves left scars upon the family. The children, though quiet, seemed to resist the physician's touch. Their eyes followed the doctor's with an intensity that made grown men uncomfortable. One doctor reported that the twins never blinked during his entire examination, staring at him with what he described as a knowingness I cannot attribute to children. Another left the town abruptly, refusing to return, saying only that the children's silence had unnerved him more than any illness he had ever encountered. Despite the interest of these men, little good came from their visits. If anything, their presence deepened the mystery. The town grew more restless as stories of medical curiosities leaked out. Strangers began to arrive, asking to see the children. Some came out of genuine curiosity, others came with cruel amusement, treating the twins as spectacles rather than human beings. Elias turned most away, but not all. Poverty pressed the family hard, and the temptation of payment for a glimpse became harder to resist. In one case, a physician from Savannah offered money simply to sit in the same room as the children for an hour. He took no measurements, asked no questions, only sat in silence as they stared at him. When he left, he reportedly told a colleague that he felt the air in the room grow heavier the longer he remained, as though time itself had slowed. He did not write of this in his official notes, but years later the story surfaced in his private letters, unearthed by historians. The records that do survive from these examinations are troubling in another way. Many are inconsistent, contradictory, or suspiciously incomplete. Measurements do not match from one doctor to another. Ages are recorded differently. Some documents vanish entirely from archives without explanation. It is as though the evidence itself resists clarity, slipping away whenever certainty approaches. Neighbors, of course, saw none of this as a scientific inquiry. To them, the visits from outsiders only confirmed the unnaturalness of the children. What kind of family needed physicians traveling from distant cities? What kind of children drew strangers who scribbled in notebooks as though documenting monsters? Each arrival of a doctor, each carriage stopping at the family's home, deepened the town's sense that the twins were not merely peculiar, they were dangerous. Margaret's diaries again give us a window into her despair. One entry reads, "They come with promises, but they leave with questions. They prod my children, write their notes, and depart. And when they are gone, we are left alone with the same stares, the same fear. Each visit is another wound. The children themselves, though subjected to endless intrusion, seemed unchanged by it all. They did not cry during examinations, nor protest. They sat in silence, answering rarely when asked their names or ages. Sometimes they exchanged glances with one another, as if sharing a private language, and always their faces remained still childlike yet solemn, soft yet unyielding. For the town, these were the frozen years, the long stretch of time in which the twins did not grow, did not change, and yet became heavier presences with every passing season. Each year added to the sense of dread. Each failed attempt at explanation deepened the fear. The family, once merely burdened by shame, now seemed to exist at the edge of something darker, a mystery that science could not resolve and that faith did not want to name. The failure of doctors to provide answers did not quiet the town. If anything, it left a void, and in small, isolated communities. Voids are quickly filled with something older, darker, and far more dangerous than science superstition. By the late 1830s, rumors of the twins had shifted from whispers of pity to murmurs of outright fear. In sermons, the local clergy began to speak more directly, no longer veiling his words with vague allusions. Pastor Caldwell, a stern man with a voice that carried like thunder through the wooden rafters of the church, stood before his congregation one sweltering Sunday and declared, "Some among us are marked. The Lord, in His wisdom, shows us signs. And when the signs are unholy, it is not for us to ignore them, but to confront them." His eyes lingered heavily on the pew where Elias and Margaret once sat. They had long since ceased attending services, yet everyone knew the message was for them. The townspeople absorbed his words eagerly. For many, it was easier to see the twins as instruments of evil than to admit that the world contained mysteries beyond their grasp. If science could not explain, then surely the devil could. And once such an idea takes root, it grows fast, like rot in damp wood. Stories began to spread, not just of the twins as curiosities, but as omens. Some claimed they were changelings, children stolen by otherworldly forces and replaced with copies that looked human but were not. The folk tales of Europe, tales the settlers' ancestors had carried across the Atlantic, resurfaced in the humid fields of Georgia. Changelings, it was said, never grew, never aged, and carried within them the malice of the inhuman. For many, the description fit too perfectly. Older residents recalled stories their own grandparents had whispered by firelight of children who looked normal, but whose presence poisoned households, who brought famine, misfortune, or death to livestock. Now, as accidents and illnesses swept the town, all ordinary tragedies of the frontier people began to connect them to the twins. A farmer whose cow miscarried a calf swore he had seen the twins at his fence the day before. A woman whose infant died in her sleep muttered that she had dreamed of the children standing silently at the foot of her bed. None of these stories could be proved, yet proof was not required. Fear stitched them together, and soon the town's collective memory was rewriting itself. Every hardship, every loss, became part of the legend of the children who would not grow. Pastor Caldwell fueled the fire further. In one sermon, he spoke directly of the devil's ability to corrupt God's creation. "Beware," he intoned, "for Satan takes delight in mockery. He can fashion a child that bears the face of innocence but the heart of damnation. He can place in our midst what looks like kin, but is not." Congregants nodded solemnly. And though he never named the twins, there was no doubt in anyone's mind who he meant. The more the church pressed this view, the more the family's isolation deepened. Some townsfolk would cross the street rather than pass near Elias in the square. Margaret, when she rarely appeared, found doors closed to her. conversations dying in her presence. Even children, emboldened by their parents' fear, began to taunt the family from a distance, calling out names like devil's brood or forest spawn. The twins themselves remained silent. They walked together, hand in hand, their expressions unchanged, their gazes level and cold. This silence only made matters worse. Had they protested, perhaps some shred of sympathy might have lingered. But their stillness seemed to confirm the fears of others, as though they were too inhuman to feel pain, too unnatural to cry. Private journals from the period capture the rising hysteria. One woman wrote, "There is something in their eyes that chills me. They are children, yet not children. When I see them, I feel the same dread as when thunder cracks overhead, though the sky is clear." Another account, from a traveling merchant, described entering the tavern and finding the townsfolk speaking heatedly of how long God would allow such creatures to remain in their midst. The town's shift from pity to hostility was perhaps inevitable. Humans fear what they cannot understand, and in the 1830s, in the quiet woods of Georgia, fear often turned to accusations of witchcraft or curses. Margaret's diaries reveal the toll this took. "They look upon us as if we carry the plague. They believe my children cursed, and thus they see me cursed as well. My prayers grow thin. Each night I ask why God has done this, and each night there is no answer." Some families began to forbid their children from going near the woods where the twins were sometimes seen wandering. It was said that if you looked too long into their eyes, you would dream of them, and that such dreams brought misfortune. A man claimed that, after seeing the twins standing in his field, the next morning his crops were blackened with blight. Another swore he had heard them speaking in the dark, though their mouths did not move. Whether any of these tales were true no longer mattered. Belief gave them power, and the belief that the children were unholy was stronger than any testimony of their innocence. In such an atmosphere, every glance, every silence, every unexplained illness became fuel for the fire. The twins were no longer just children who did not grow. They were symbols, vessels of fear, embodiments of something the town could neither name nor control. And once a community convinces itself that evil walks among them, the outcome is seldom mercy. These were the years when fear became doctrine, when rumor became truth, and when two silent children were reshaped into something monstrous in the imagination of an entire town. By the early 1840s, shame alone was no longer the family's heaviest burden. Hunger began to press itself into their lives with relentless force. The crops Elias once relied upon to support his household had withered in consecutive seasons, struck by blight, drought, and neglect. Neighbors, once willing to barter, now kept their distance, whispering that any trade with the cursed family invited misfortune. Margaret's careful housekeeping could no longer keep hunger from creeping through their doors. In such desperation, it was perhaps inevitable that the family turned to what the outside world desired most from them: spectacle. Strangers had already begun to appear, drawn by rumor of the children who never grew. At first, Elias turned them away, burning with humiliation at the thought of his children displayed like curiosities. But as poverty gnawed and opportunities dried up, he wavered. A man can endure shame for only so long when his family faces starvation. It was a traveling showman who finally broke him. Passing through the region with a small wagon of oddities, a two-headed calf preserved in spirits, a jar of malformed fetuses, a dog born with an extra limb, the man heard of the twins and sought them out. He spoke smoothly, promising Elias money in exchange for allowing the children to be exhibited. "People will pay dearly," he said, "to look upon what they cannot understand." "Why not let their curiosity feed your table?" Margaret resisted fiercely. Her diary records one entry scrawled in frantic script: "Better to starve with dignity than to make our children a carnival." Yet hunger wore her down, and Elias, silent and haunted, eventually gave in. The first exhibition took place at a county fair. A makeshift tent was erected, painted signs outside advertising the eternal children, see the mystery of Georgia with your own eyes for a few coins. Strangers filed inside to gape. The twins sat side by side upon a wooden bench, dressed in simple clothes, their pale faces unchanged. They did not speak. They did not smile. They simply stared back at those who stared at them. The reactions varied. Some gasped in wonder. Others laughed cruelly, and many crossed themselves in fear. One man muttered that he felt colder the longer he looked at them, as though their presence drew the warmth out of the air. A woman fainted outright, claiming later that their eyes had followed her even as she turned away. Yet, for every shudder of dread, coins clinked into the showman's hand. Money trickled into the family at last, enough for food and firewood. But with it came humiliation. The children, who had once been the subject of whispers, were now objects of public spectacle. Strangers traveled miles to gape, to prod, to test whether the rumors were true. Some brought their own children, pushing them forward with nervous laughter, saying, "Look, these are the devil's little ones." The twins remained silent through it all, their faces unreadable, as though their minds were elsewhere. Elias stood outside the tent during exhibitions, his jaw clenched, his hat pulled low. He could not watch. Margaret sometimes sat beside her children, weeping silently while strangers jeered. If the twins noticed, they gave no sign. Over time, the exhibitions grew. The showman urged the family to travel with him, promising greater profits in Savannah, Charleston, even farther north. Desperation drove them to agree. And so the twins became part of the traveling exhibition circuit, carried from fair to fair, town to town. Each new audience reacted the same fascination, revulsion, disbelief. Doctors came to see them, scribbling new notes, each no wiser than the last. Ministers visited and left shaken. Ordinary folk told stories that grew with each retelling, that the children's faces never changed, that their eyes gleamed red in lantern light, that their voices when they did speak sounded not like children but like something older. The journals of one spectator survive, written by a young man who saw the exhibition in Charleston. He wrote, "Their bodies were of children, but their eyes were of stone. They looked not at us, but through us." I felt that they knew me, though I knew them not, and I left with a heaviness, as though part of myself had been seen and taken. Such testimonies only fueled the legend. Newspapers began to print small articles, calling them the frozen twins of Georgia. Some mocked them as frauds, suggesting the family had staged an elaborate trick. Others took the matter more seriously, describing them as a living mystery that no natural philosophy may yet explain. But regardless of tone, the result was the same: more fame, more fascination, more shame. For the family, the money provided survival, but at a terrible cost. Margaret's writings during this time are filled with despair. Each coin we accept feels like a stone upon my chest. We sell their silence, we sell their shame. What kind of mother am I, to let strangers feast upon my children's sorrow? The twins themselves seemed untouched by the spectacle, or perhaps resigned to it. They rarely spoke during the journeys, rarely interacted with others. Some claimed they never slept, that no matter the hour, their eyes were open, watching. Others swore they saw the children smile faintly, not with joy, but with a strange knowingness, as if they alone understood the futility of the world's gawking. By the end of these years, the family had become trapped in a cruel paradox. The exhibitions kept them alive, yet deepened their isolation. They were no longer simply a family on the outskirts of Georgia, but living myths paraded before strangers. The shame that once burdened them privately was now public, etched into the memory of every gawking face. And through it all, the twins remained the same small, pale, unchanging, eternal children who defied the passage of time, even as the world aged around them. As the twins' notoriety spread beyond rural fairs and dusty crossroads, their story began to seep into the circles of learning. By the mid-1840s, their names, or at least the epithet given to them, the frozen twins of Georgia, appeared in early medical journals. The case was whispered about in lecture halls from Savannah to Philadelphia. Students of anatomy and physicians with academic ambitions saw in the twins a chance to study what seemed to defy the natural order. The family, wearied from years of humiliation, reluctantly permitted further examinations. Unlike the crude inspections of traveling doctors, these new studies were conducted with the authority of institutions. Professors traveled long distances, carrying with them notebooks, surgical tools, and a certainty that reason could pierce any veil of mystery. And yet, the more they observed, the stranger the records became. A professor from Augusta College, writing in 1844, noted the children display all the markers of vitality. Yet, the growth of bone and muscle is curiously halted. Their teeth remain as those of juveniles. Without progression, their pulse is steady, but upon extended observation, time seems of less consequence in their presence. A quarter-hour stretches, the air grows stagnant. One feels, when with them, that the ordinary rhythm of life has faltered. This last remark, strikingly unscientific, would later be crossed out in the published version of his paper. But in the margins of his surviving notes, the words remain. Other journals repeated the same puzzle. Measurements taken a year apart showed no change in height or weight. Drawings of their faces, sketched by medical illustrators, were identical from one year to the next, down to the curve of a cheek and the spacing of their eyes. Some examiners concluded the family was lying about the children's ages, presenting them as older than they were. But those who compared baptismal records and birth registers confirmed the impossible by calendar years. The twins should have been nearly adolescents, yet their bodies were trapped in perpetual childhood. The contradictions did not stop there. Reports varied wildly in details. One physician described the children as frail, delicate, and prone to lethargy. Another, only months later, wrote of their remarkable vitality, claiming he had seen them walking the length of a field with tireless energy. A third insisted their skin was unnaturally cold to the touch, while yet another wrote that their warmth was ordinary. These inconsistencies puzzled later historians, but some researchers noted that such contradictions were common in accounts of phenomena that slipped between the cracks of reason and fear. Most disturbing of all was the vanishing of records. At least 3 published articles make reference to earlier case studies that no longer exist. Letters between physicians mention detailed examinations that cannot now be found. Even whole notebooks, referenced in bibliographies, have disappeared from archives. Archivists searching later would write notes such as, "File missing, no explanation or referred source does not exist." It is tempting to blame the poor record-keeping of the era. Yet, many scholars felt there was something uncanny about the way evidence of the twins slipped away, as though history itself refused to hold them, spitting out the details like a body rejecting poison. Elias and Margaret endured these intrusions with quiet despair. For each examination, each journal entry, each sketch in ink, they hoped perhaps for a solution, a cure, or at least an answer that would render their children human again in the eyes of their community. But no answer came. Instead, the scientific world fed upon the twins as hungrily as the gawking crowds at fairs. The family's suffering was transformed into academic curiosity, printed in journals for strangers to debate. Margaret wrote in her diary, "They take notes, but they do not see. They prod and measure, but they do not feel." They call my children a case, not souls, and when they leave, we are left the same burdened, broken, and unanswered. Some physicians, however, admitted quietly what they could not put to paper. One traveling doctor confessed in a letter that the longer he remained in the children's presence, the more unsettled he became. He described feeling as if the ticking of his pocket watch slowed, though later he found the time had passed normally. Another claimed that when he turned his back, he heard the faint murmur of voices, though the twins' lips had not moved. Both men abandoned their studies soon after, choosing to leave the case to others. Yet curiosity only grew. The twins' story crossed borders, reaching Europe. British journals debated whether they were a fraud, a medical marvel, or evidence of divine or demonic intervention. A French physician wrote that such cases might prove the plasticity of time in the human form, though his article was dismissed as poetic fancy rather than science. Back home in Georgia, these academic debates brought no relief. If anything, they magnified the family's torment. Their children were now no longer just the curse of a town, but the subject of international speculation. Neighbors read what scraps of articles they could find and only felt their suspicions confirmed if the learned men of the world could not explain the twins. Then surely they must be unnatural. The journals, the vanished notes, the contradictions, all of it formed a strange record that stands today not as explanation, but as testimony. A testimony not of what the twins were, but of how deeply they unsettled those who tried to understand them. It was during these years that the line between science and superstition blurred most dangerously. For when physicians failed to solve the mystery, the community once again turned to its oldest answer that what science could not explain, the devil surely could. And so the stage was set for the family's next descent, where the twins were no longer curiosities or case studies, but living symbols of evil in the imagination of those around them. By the late 1840s, the line between rumor and reality had nearly dissolved. The family no longer needed to attend fairs or endure medical examinations for the stories to spread. The twins had become a living legend, and those who lived near them swore they had begun to witness things that could not be explained by science or faith. What once had been whispers of arrested growth now turned into testimonies of the impossible. The first accounts were of voices. Several neighbors insisted that, at night, when the fields were quiet and the only sounds were the insects droning in the humid air, strange murmurs drifted from the family's cabin. They claimed the words did not sound like children's voices, nor even like those of Elias or Margaret. Instead, they were low, rhythmic, almost like chanting. A woman who lived half a mile away wrote in her diary, "It was as if two voices spoke together, but deeper, older, not belonging to the small forms I have seen. I prayed, but still I heard them until dawn." Soon after, stories emerged of the twins being seen in two places at once. A farmer swore he passed them near the riverbank one morning as they stooped to gather stones, their hands dipping into the current. But that same hour, his wife claimed she saw them watching from the upstairs window of their house. When the farmer insisted this was impossible, his wife grew pale and said, "I know what I saw. They were there, both of them." Similar accounts multiplied the twins at the edge of the woods, and at the same time seen walking the road into town. The contradictions unnerved even the most skeptical. Then came the stories of time itself behaving strangely around them. A merchant traveling through town stopped at the family's home, curious after hearing the local tales. He claimed that while speaking to Elias in the yard, he felt his watch ticking slower and slower. When he finally looked, the hands had not moved at all for several minutes. Yet, when he returned to town, he found more than an hour had passed. It was as though time thickened near them. He later wrote in a letter, like a river slowed by ice, though all else seemed unchanged. Such testimonies spread like wildfire. For every skeptical laugh, there were 2 voices swearing it was true. A schoolteacher reported that one of her pupils, a boy of 8, came to class pale and shaken, insisting he had seen the twins standing in the woods, unmoving, while his father at that same moment saw them near the church. When pressed, the boy burst into tears, unable to explain. Another man insisted that when he locked eyes with one of the twins, he felt a sudden rush of memories, not his own fleeting images of battles, faces, and landscapes he had never seen. He refused to look at them again. Margaret's diaries during these years grow increasingly fragmented. One entry reads, "They whisper to each other when no one else hears. At times I enter the room, and they fall silent, their eyes fixed on me as if they know my every thought. Sometimes I wonder if even I am their mother, or if I, too, have been replaced by something else." The twins themselves gave no explanation. They never admitted to voices, nor to being in 2 places at once. When asked directly by one frightened physician whether they understood what others said about them, they only looked at each other and then turned away, silent. Yet their very silence seemed like confirmation of the uncanny. With each new account, fear hardened. The townsfolk no longer merely suspected a curse, they were convinced the children existed outside the natural order. Tales of changelings returned with new vigor, now infused with these supposed supernatural events. And though many accounts might be explained by imagination, exaggeration, or outright fabrication, the sheer number of them gave the impression of undeniable truth. Even skeptics admitted unease. A carpenter who worked near the family's property told others he felt his tools grow heavy, his arms weak, whenever the twins drew near. A group of hunters swore that when they saw the children at the edge of the woods, all the forest fell silent. No birds, no insects, only the oppressive stillness of their presence. One hunter later confessed he fled without firing a shot, feeling that the twins had seen into his soul. What made these accounts more chilling was their consistency across time and distance. Farmers, merchants, travelers, women, men, even children repeated variations of the same themes, the voices, the doubling, the warping of time. It was as though the town had woven a tapestry of dread. Each thread spun from both fear and testimony. Whether true or not, it became impossible to separate fact from belief. Margaret and Elias endured these rumors in silence, but their suffering deepened. Margaret's health declined, her writing more desperate, her faith more shaken. Elias grew more withdrawn, rarely speaking even to those few who still offered kindness. It was as if the family itself had been consumed by the legend, reduced to symbols in a story the town was writing without their consent. Yet the twins themselves remained unchanged. Their bodies did not grow, their faces stayed childlike, their silence unbroken. They stood at the center of a storm of belief, unmoving, as if time itself had anchored them while all else swirled with fear. And so the community's perception shifted once more. The twins were no longer curiosities, nor even symbols of shame. They had become something far more dangerous in the imagination of their neighbors, proof that reality could bend, that the world might not be governed by God or science, but by something far older and darker. By the dawn of the 1850s, the house on the edge of town no longer looked like a home. Its timbers sagged, its shutters hung crooked, and weeds swallowed the yard that once bore neat rows of crops. What had been a modest but respectable farmstead when Elias and Margaret married was now a husk, marked by silence and shadows. To the townsfolk, it was more than mere decay, it was the outward sign of the curse they believed had taken root inside. Poverty had carved its signature into the family. The money, once trickling in from exhibitions and gawkers, had dwindled. For novelty always fades. Strangers still whispered of the eternal children of Georgia, but fewer traveled to see them. Other spectacles, fresher curiosities had taken their place on the fair circuits. Elias, older and wearier, no longer had the will to drag his children across counties to be stared at. Hunger returned with sharp teeth, and then came sickness. Margaret, already frail from years of sleepless nights and quiet despair, took ill one winter. Neighbors claimed she looked pale and hollow-eyed, her body as thin as paper. She wrote in her diary, "One final time I feel myself unraveling, as if the weight of their silence has bled into me. When I look at them, I see the child I bore, yet I feel something else staring back." Within weeks she was dead, carried to her grave under a sky so gray the preacher remarked it seemed God himself had closed his eyes. Elias, left alone with the twins, grew harder. He rarely spoke. His once broad shoulders now stooped, his beard unkempt, his clothes ragged. Neighbors reported seeing him wander at night, muttering prayers or curses under his breath. He nailed the shutters of the house shut, as though to block out the world, or perhaps to keep the world from seeing what lingered inside. But Margaret's death was only the beginning. Tragedy soon spread to the extended family. Elias's younger brother, who lived several miles away, died suddenly in a fire that consumed his barn and house. No cause was ever found. An aunt who had once dared to speak openly of the twins' strangeness fell ill with fever and perished within days. Another cousin was thrown from a horse and killed, though the animal had never before been unruly. Each death was ordinary in isolation accidents, illness, misfortune. But in the minds of the townsfolk the pattern was clear. The curse was spreading, consuming all blood connected to Elias's line. Whispers thickened into conviction. Their kin are marked. One woman told her neighbors, any one of their blood will fall. It will not end until the line is severed. The phrase carried like wildfire. The house itself became a kind of omen. Travelers passing along the road spoke of seeing its roof line silhouetted against the evening sky, dark and crooked like a broken tooth. Some swore they heard strange sounds from within, not voices exactly, but a hum, a vibration that set their horses on edge. One man claimed the very air around the house felt heavier, as though the earth itself rejected the dwelling. Inside, the decline deepened. Food grew scarce. Elias bartered what little he could, but few wanted to deal with him. The twins, as ever, remained unchanged, while their father aged, while their mother sickened and died, while cousins and uncles were buried. They stayed the same small, pale, silent, untouched by years. Their unchanging forms became unbearable proof to many that they were the cause of all that decay. Neighbors began to cross themselves when passing the property. Some avoided the road altogether, taking long detours through the woods rather than risk the sight of the house. Children dared one another to approach the fence, but few had the courage. Those who did claimed they saw the twins standing in the window, watching, their eyes reflecting the moonlight in ways no human eyes should. The decay of the household seemed to mirror the decay of hope itself. With Margaret gone, the diaries ceased. No written voice survives from within the house after her death, save for one letter Elias attempted to send to a distant cousin. In it he wrote, "They are unchanged. They are as they ever were. I do not know if they are my children or some trick played upon me. I pray to God, but hear nothing. I fear what I live with is not of him." The letter was never answered. The townsfolk, meanwhile, grew restless. When accidents struck their own families, they looked to Elias's house for explanation. When a child drowned in the river, when a woman miscarried, when a man was struck down by sudden fever, the whispers returned to the same refrain. It is them. It is the twins. Superstition and misfortune intertwined until the house became a focal point for the town's collective dread. No one would help Elias repair his barn. No one would trade him seeds or livestock. He and his children were left in isolation, their world crumbling around them, their survival hanging by a thread. It is during these years that the legend hardened. The family's decline was no longer seen as tragedy, but as divine confirmation. Every sickness, every death, every crack in the timbers of their house became another verse in the story the town was telling itself that the twins were not children, but curses wearing the faces of children. By the close of the decade, the house stood as a ruin in progress, half abandoned, though still occupied, its inhabitants reduced as shadows. It was not merely a family falling into poverty, it was a family consumed by something darker, something the town itself believed had been set loose upon them. And still, the twins did not change. It was in the spring of 1851 that the silence deepened into something more permanent. By then, the household was already a ruin, its yard tangled with weeds, its shutters rotting, the roof sagging like a body ready to collapse. Elias had grown into a ghost of a man, rarely seen except at dawn when he walked the property's edge, muttering prayers or curses no one could decipher. The twins, unchanged, still lingered in windows or wandered the yard hand in hand, pale figures against the sagging timbers. And then, one morning, they were gone. The disappearance was first noted by a neighbor who passed the house at sunrise. He reported that the shutters stood open for the first time in years, creaking in the wind, but the windows were empty. Later that day, another neighbor ventured closer and found the front door ajar, swinging gently. Inside, the rooms bore no signs of life. A few belongings lay scattered, a wooden doll Margaret had once carved, Elias's worn Bible left open on the table, a tin plate with crumbs still clinging to it. But of the children, there was no sign. Elias himself was gone as well. His bed appeared unslept in, his boots still by the door. The only human presence was absence, as if the entire household had evaporated in the night. The townsfolk, once so fearful of approaching, now gathered cautiously at the edge of the property. They whispered to one another, none daring to step inside. Finally, a group of men entered. They searched the rooms, the cellar, the barn, even the overgrown yard. Nothing. No footprints in the soft earth. No wagon tracks leading away. The horses had long since been sold or eaten, and there was no sign of departure. The family seemed to have vanished without a trace. Testimonies quickly began to conflict. One woman swore she had seen the twins walking near the river just the evening before, their hands clasped, their faces turned toward the setting sun. A man insisted he heard children's laughter in the woods at midnight, though he admitted it was not laughter like he had ever heard before, hollow, echoing, too steady. Another claimed that at dawn he saw Elias himself standing at the fence line, his face pale, his eyes fixed on nothing, before he turned and simply faded into the air. In the absence of evidence, rumor became truth. Some said Elias had finally taken his children into the woods and ended the curse himself. Others whispered that the devil had reclaimed what was his, spirits vanishing into the earth. A few claimed the children had never been human at all, only phantoms who had haunted the town for years, now dissipated as suddenly as they had come. The house remained, but it no longer felt like a place where humans had lived. Travelers described the rooms as strangely cold, even in the heat of summer. Dust settled quickly, as though time inside moved differently. Objects left upon tables seemed to shift from day to day, a plate here, a chair there, without explanation. Some swore they still saw movement in the windows at night, two small silhouettes staring outward, though the house was empty. Years later, when researchers tried to piece together what happened, they found the accounts hopelessly contradictory. Official records list no burial, no sale of property, no trace of Elias or the twins leaving town. The census of the following year omits them entirely, as if they had never existed. Yet journals, newspapers, and diaries all mention the disappearance, though never in agreement about the details. One physician who had examined the twins years earlier traveled back to Georgia upon hearing of their vanishing. He described entering the house and finding Elias's Bible still open on the table. The page was from the book of Job, the verse underlined in a trembling hand, "Man that is born of a woman is of few days, and full of trouble." The physician noted in his journal, "It was as though Elias had left me a message." Yet, whether it was despair or revelation, I cannot say. In the town, the disappearance only deepened the legend. Parents warned children not to wander near the house, lest the twins return and take them away. Hunters avoided the woods, swearing that at dusk they still heard the faint murmur of voices among the trees. One boy claimed that when he threw a rock at the empty house, he heard laughter answer him from inside. Some insisted the family had fled, seeking to escape the relentless fear and hatred of their neighbors. Perhaps Elias had finally carried his children far away, to begin life anew where no one knew their secret. But even this hopeful version unraveled when no sign of them appeared in any town, any record, any memory beyond that place. They had not resettled. They had not been seen again. The silence that followed was worse than their presence. For years, the abandoned house stood as a scar at the edge of the community. Windows broken, roof collapsing, weeds climbing the walls. Yet none dared tear it down. It remained, a husk filled with the memory of what had lived there or what had lingered. And every time misfortune struck the town, eyes drifted towards that ruin, as though it still held the twins' shadow. By the late century, travelers passing through sometimes heard the tale of the children who never grew, told by old men who remembered them, or by descendants who had inherited the fear. Each version was different. Some swore the twins had wings hidden beneath their clothes, others that they could vanish and reappear at will. But all agreed on one thing one morning. They were simply gone, and no one could explain where they went. In that silence, their legend only grew stronger. Decades passed, but the silence of that spring morning never lifted. By the 1860s, the old Elias homestead had collapsed into ruin. The roof caved in, the timbers blackened with rot, and vines strangled the last traces of human habitation. Yet the memory of the twins lingered like smoke, refusing to disperse. They had vanished, yes, but their absence only deepened the unease. For in time, fragments began to surface, each piece of evidence stirring the legend back to life. The first fragment was discovered by children. In 1867, a group of boys exploring the overgrown site claimed to have found a small box hidden beneath the floorboards of the ruined house. Inside lay brittle pages from a diary, written in a hand identified later as Margaret's. Though faded and water-stained, some words could still be made out. One entry read, "They do not age. I no longer pray for them to grow. I pray only that I might understand what they are." Another passage seemed stranger still. "Last night they stood at my bedside. I woke, but knew I'd not been sleeping. Their lips did not move. Yet I heard their voices as clearly as my own thoughts." The boys carried the box into town, where their parents promptly burned the papers in the churchyard, declaring them blasphemy. Yet rumors of the words spread before the smoke had cleared. It was the first spark to reignite the legend. Years later, during the Reconstruction era, a farmer plowing land near the woods unearthed what appeared to be a small grave, unmarked except for 2 crude stones at its head and foot. No coffin, only a shallow burial. Inside, bones were found, but they were the bones of children, strangely small, as if belonging to bodies no older than 5 or 6. The farmer, terrified, reburied them and told no one until old age loosened his tongue. When the story became known, some whispered that the townsfolk had taken matters into their own hands, that Elias's children had not vanished but had been put to rest in secret. Others rejected this, pointing out that no one in town ever confessed, even on their deathbeds. In the 1880s, a traveling scholar from Boston, collecting folk tales of the South, recorded the twins' story in his notebooks. He spoke with old residents who remembered them, and their testimonies were chilling in their consistency. They did not grow, one elderly woman told him flatly. I was older than them when they were born, and when I had children of my own, they were still the same size. They stared at me once, and I have never forgotten it. It was like seeing myself reflected in a mirror that hated me. Another man told the scholar that when the twins vanished, he dreamt of them for 7 nights in a row, always standing at the edge of his bed, their hands clasped, their eyes watching. The scholar attempted to track down official records, birth of baptism, census, but found only fragments. Some documents seemed to contradict each other. Others had vanished entirely from archives. It was as if history itself recoiled from fixing the twins too firmly in place. He concluded that their story straddled the line between folklore and fact. Yet even he admitted in his journals, there is a heaviness to their tale, as if one dares not press too closely. It is not only what they were, but what remains of them that unsettles the heart. By the close of the century, local children still dared one another to approach the ruins where the house once stood. Some claimed that if you lingered long enough, you would hear soft voices in the wind, voices too low and steady to be mere imagination. A few swore they saw 2 small figures dart between the trees at dusk. Skeptics scoffed, yet even they admitted a strange unease when passing that part of the woods. The graves, the diary fragments, the inconsistent records all combined to keep the mystery alive. The twins had never grown in life, and in death they refused to decay into simple memory. Their legend took on a second life, feeding itself through every scrap of testimony, every whispered account, every shadow seen at twilight. To this day, local folklore insists that the twins never truly died. Some believe they still wander the woods, unchanged, appearing only to those who dare to seek them. Others suggest they resurface every few generations, appearing in new families, their curse inherited through blood. A handful of scholars argue that the very contradictions in the records are proof not of poor memory, but of some deeper distortion that time itself bends strangely around their story, just as witnesses once claimed it did around their bodies. What is certain is this: the town never forgot. Long after the house crumbled, long after those who had known the family were buried, the tale endured. In church sermons, in campfire whispers, in the private diaries of men and women too ashamed to admit their fear, the twins lived on. They had been flesh once, perhaps, but by the end of the century they were something else, symbols of the unknown, echoes of a mystery no one could bury. And when the wind moves through the abandoned fields where their house once stood, some say the sound is not the rustle of leaves at all, but the faint cadence of children's voices, voices that never grew, voices that never aged, voices that may never end,